Well, I don't want to wear you out our first time together, and I did tell some of you that I would share a story, didn't I? So let me pull up one to share here. I've set this one aside. This first story that I share is one called Holy Moses. That's Wholly. Holy Moses. It is a story that centers around a young boy named Barton Bell and his Sunday school teacher, whose name is Elmira Briggs. Oh, there are a good number of other people in the story too, but those are the two central characters. Chapter 1 starts years ago when Barton was quite young, and Elmira, well, she's not quite so young, but you'll see how this all unfolds. So here we go. Holy Moses, Chapter 1, appropriately named Beginnings. It was a beautiful spring morning, and the warm light of the rising 9:30 sun washed gently through the leaves of a tall cypress tree and into the eastern windows of the Brook Meadow Church. There, falling through 4 dusty window panes behind Elmira Briggs, it illuminated the top of her head, giving her an appearance of an angelic presence. This morning was Elmira's second week to teach the Elementary 2 Sunday School class, which she had inherited by the unanimous vote of the Sunday School superintendent at the unexpected passing of the former teacher, Ida Merle Jones. Elmira knew that accepting the position would guarantee her a life sentence of teaching this age group, which, having no children of her own, she had absolutely no experience in dealing with whatsoever. A life sentence indeed, thought Elmira. Ida Merle had taken the position around the time of the First World War, when the teacher before her had come down with the mumps. Assured that the substitution would be only for a Sunday or two, Ida Merle agreed, only to find herself still teaching the class some 40 years later. "I had no idea the mumps could last so long," she often jested. But alas, Ida Merle had gone on to receive her eternal reward, and the position had become vacant once again. "Elmira," Sunday School Superintendent Nate Thatcher had said in his recruitment speech, "if the good Lord had had someone better in mind for the job, I'm certain he would have impressed my heart with his or her name." By this, of course, what the determined Mr. Thatcher was saying was that he had already tried to award the position to a gamut of individuals, and the good Lord had apparently not impressed anyone he had asked up to now to accept it. Elmira had been instilled with a very keen sense of spiritual duty and service in her upbringing, and after some deliberation, she decided to respond affirmatively to the Lord's calling for her to teach Elementary 2. With rapt attention and a few gaping mouths, her audience of students, ages ranging from 4 to 6, listened as she brought to life the scenes from the daily Bible lesson. Here she read, "That night, Samuel had gotten ready for bed and had laid down on his pallet there in the temple of the Lord." Clara Cooper, a 4-year-old with auburn curls, inadvertently interrupted the lesson when she leaned over and whispered not so quietly to the girl next to her, "What's a temple?" cupping her hand beside her mouth, hoping to ensure privacy. "You don't know?" inquired Bubby Harper, taking no such measures for discretion. Bubby was a hefty 6-year-old with butch-cut blonde hair whose finger never seemed to leave his nose. Hoping to aid in Clara's education, he added, "Your temple is that part of your head, right there," utilizing his picking finger to temporarily point to the correct spot on the side of his head next to his eye. "Only you're not supposed to hit people there, or you'll get in big trouble." "David did," Clara countered defensively, adding, "Verl Patterson said that's where David hit Goliath with that rock and killed him dead as a hammer." Gwendolyn Myers nodded in agreement while playing with the white satin ribbon on the hem of her purple polka dot dress. Gwendolyn's father owned the local stone quarry, which certainly made her a credible testimony. "Uh-huh, and that's why you don't do it," Bubby replied, satisfied that Clara had proven his point. Sensing the need to bring the discussion back toward center, Mrs. Briggs joined the rabbit chase briefly. Unless I'm mistaken, I believe that David hit Goliath not on the temple, but square between the eyes. But you are correct, Bubby, in that you should never hit someone there on the side. So, Clara chimed in, Samuel was sleeping on the side of someone's head? A shower of giggles and laughter arose from the semicircle of chairs facing Elmira's own, and she couldn't help but join them. No, Clara, Mrs. Briggs replied. Samuel was about to sleep in a different kind of temple. Let me explain. What do we call the big room in our church where we listen to Reverend Wharton tell us about Jesus? Can anyone tell me? There was a moment of silence and a concerted movement of turning of heads as every eye scanned the room for an uplifted hand. None were to be seen. Finally, Elmira decided it was time to take suggestions and determined that the ever-silent Barton Bell, seated immediately to her right, would join the discussion. With his 7th birthday only weeks away, Barton was the oldest student in the class, but his shy character had kept him from becoming an example for the others to follow. Barton, why don't you tell us? The teacher asked. Barton's deep brown eyes became saucers of disbelief and fear, looking first at Mrs. Briggs and then at the faces of his classmates who seemed to be enjoying his predicament. Yeah, Barton, tell us, echoed Bubby mockingly. Mrs. Briggs was frustrated at Bobby's stuttered reaction, but ignored it for the time so that she could direct her attention back toward Barton. It's okay, Barton. Don't mind him one bit. You know the name, don't you? Barton nodded his head. Okay, so why don't you share it with the rest of the class? Up to this point, Barton Bell had sat rather slouched in his chair, but clearing his throat, he sat straight up and announced, It's called the Sanctuary. Immediately, the other children erupted in laughter. Bubby Harper actually stopped picking his nose long enough to slap his knee in glee at Barton's expense. See there, Miss Briggs? That's why Miss Jones never asked him nothing. Barton don't talk much. Why, he can barely talk at all. Again, there was a wave of laughter. Barton wilted once more into his chair. Any pride he had acquired from providing the correct answer now fell from his face like tears cried so many times before at their taunting. Stop it, children, Elmira exclaimed loudly with a clap of her hands. Stop it immediately. Bubby Harper, you are to be ashamed of yourself, and the rest of you too. Would you laugh so quickly at the bearer of the law of God? Who? Inquired Gwendolyn. The bearer of the law of God. Why, Moses himself, the teacher continued. Scripture tells us that Moses was slow of speech and that he stuttered. Yet, God used him to deliver the children of Israel out of bondage in Egypt. Moses led the people through the Red Sea away from Pharaoh's army to safety. It was Moses that God chose to receive the 10 Commandments there in the desert at Mount Sinai. You'll be wise not to judge a person by the clarity of their speech, boys and girls, but by the content of whatever it is they have to say. Turning again to Barton, she said, Barton, I find that I stutter sometimes when I'm anxious or upset about something. For me, it helps to stop first, take a deep breath, and just let the words flow from my heart. Why don't you give it a try? Barton was very unsure, but his eyes were held captive by the sincere kindness displayed in those of his teacher. Obediently, he drew in a deep breath and tried delivering his correct answer once again. Slowly he spoke, choosing his words almost deliberately. Sanctuary. It's called a sanctuary. He had made it. Again, he drew in a deep breath and blew this one out in a sigh of relief. Very good, Mr. Bell. Very good indeed. Elmira took the opportunity to get back to her lesson, and Barton sat up in his chair once again, a little taller than before. Returning her attention to the class, she continued, "But we were not talking about Moses, however. It was young Samuel who was about to fall asleep in the temple, which was a place very much like our own sanctuary, when he heard a voice calling his name. Samuel thought it was the priest, Eli, who had called him. So Samuel ran to Eli's bedside and woke him up. But Eli hadn't called Samuel, so he sent the boy back to bed. After only a bit, Samuel heard his name called again, and again he ran to Eli's side. But again Eli sent him back to bed. A third time this happened, and again Eli sent Samuel back to his place in the temple. Only this time he also sent instructions. The next time Samuel heard his name called, he was to reply not to Eli but to God, for it was God who was calling out to him. Samuel was to reply, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" Elmira Briggs continued teaching her simple lesson on listening for the remainder of the class hour. But for the most part, her words were lost from that point on young Barton Bell. His eyes and thoughts were looking beyond his Sunday school class and were preoccupied with visions of this fascinating individual, a man called Moses. When the hour had passed, Sunday school Superintendent Thatcher stood in the main hallway of the church education wing and rang the dismissal bell. After a moment of delay for closing prayers and the collection of literature books, one by one the doors of each classroom opened and the people began making their way toward the sanctuary, where the organist had already begun playing the opening notes of Bringing in the Sheaves. Barton Bell was usually the first person out of the room, but this morning he waited until everyone else had left, except for his teacher. Mrs. Briggs was busy replacing the chairs to their proper semicircle positions when she looked up and saw the boy standing by the door. "Did you need something, Barton?" "No, I just thought you might need someone to walk you into the sanctuary." Elmira smiled and placed her purse on her arm. "Why, that would be very nice." She walked over to where Barton was and extended her hand for escort, pausing only for a moment to turn out the light and close the door. The two of them proceeded together down the crowded hall toward the now filling sanctuary. About midway, Barton momentarily stopped walking and looked up to his teacher. "Did Moses really talk like me?" "Yes, he did," replied Elmira Briggs. "And once he got into a heap of trouble for dawdling, too," she added with a smile. "So we'd better get on into church. Your mother and father will be wondering where you've gotten off to." Barton gripped Elmira's hand a little firmer, and a warm smile broke onto his face. "Yes, ma'am, I reckon they will." Upon arriving at the door into the sanctuary, Cleve Myers, Gwendolyn's father, leaned forward and opened the sanctuary door for Elmira. Barton and a few others who were about to go through them. Barton looked up at Mr. Myers and exclaimed, "We learned about Moses this morning." "You did?" replied Cleve, and then looking to Mrs. Briggs with a smile and said, "Gwendolyn told me you all talked about Samuel." "Oh, we wandered a bit," replied Elmira, looking at her student and then at Mr. Myers again. "But we managed to cover both bases somehow." Now, as they moved into the sanctuary, Melvin Womack, the church's choir director, stood to his feet, opened his hymnal, and invited the assembling congregation to turn to page 435 of their hymnals. The organist returned to the top of the music again, and as she played, the choir began singing. "Sowing in the morning, sowing seeds of kindness, sowing in the noontide and the dewy eve, waiting for the harvest and the time of reaping, we shall come rejoicing, bringing in the sheaves. That's the end of chapter 1. Well, that's all for today. Thank you for sharing this time. I love you, and I will see you next time. Take care, stay safe, and God bless.